Hello everyone, I hope all is well. The purpose of this presentation is to give you a brief explanation of the Suez Crisis in order to make our reading for lesson 8 easier and faster so we can focus on the country of interest paper. Before I start, I would like to say that this brief is informal and it is unofficial, so please do not use it as a reference for any of the coursework. This is only to give you an idea on the subject before you start reading the course material. I would like to start by presenting some historical events that have relations to the Suez Crisis. In the 19th and the 20th century, many countries were colonized by the Ottoman Empire, France and Britain. In 1854, Egypt was still under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and this actually flag you see here is the Ottoman Empire flag. Prior to 1854, most commercial trades between Eastern and Western worlds were conducted by ships sailing around Africa at a distance averaged 12,000 miles. So as if you can see here on the map, they would depart from here, go south all around Africa, up this way, which is a very long distance. In 1954, the Ottoman King of Egypt gave a concession to a French company to dig a channel between the Red Sea and the Med. So this area here, this is the Red Sea, this is the Med. And to cut this distance almost by half, saving lots of time and money. The channel was called the Suez Canal and was built by slave workers. Thousands of workers died from cholera and epidemic, and the French company was also to operate the canal for 99 years from its opening. Egypt had some shares in the profit as well. In 1975, the Ottoman King of Egypt got in serious debt and he sold big chunk of the Egyptian shares of the canal to the United Kingdom. In 1882, Egypt went through political instability and the British invaded and took full control of the country. So they invaded Egypt and took full control of the country. So in summary so far, the canal was built to save time and money for international trades. It was built by slave labor. France and Britain had national and economical interest in the canal. Now, if we look at the 20th century, in 1922, Egypt was granted its independence and became the Kingdom of Egypt. But British influence continued to dominate Egypt's political life. Britain also retained control of the canal zone, the police forces, the army, the railways, and the communication. British troops were stationed in cities and towns in Egypt. So really, when you think about it, they have not left Egypt. I put here, if you look, the Egyptian flag on the map for simplicity. This is the current flag. The flag at that time was different, but again, just for simplicity, I kept the same flag throughout. In 1939, World War II started. And one important point to mention here is the state of Israel did not exist at this point. And that geographical area was known as Palestine. Palestine was considered an Arab land by most of its citizens and neighboring countries. I do strongly recommend reading about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict if you are planning to have a long career in the military. You will find that many problems in the Middle East are rooted to this area. So it is on the map, this area here. So at this point, 1938, this is Palestine under the British mandate. 1945, the war ended. And as a result of not having a common enemy between the US and the Soviets, the Cold War started. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared. I don't want to get into too much details on this subject because it will confuse most of us. However, long story short, some countries felt that the Jews deserve their own state, and Palestine was the right location for it due to historical roots. However, the Arabs, on the other hand, saw this as invasion of their land, and right away, conflict started between the Arabs and Israel. In 1952, a group of officers led a military coup against the king of Egypt. Of course, they called it a revolution, not a coup, but by definition, it is a coup. It was led by Colonel Nasser, who became the Egyptian president later on. And yes, I am named after this man, and I still hold it against my father, and I'm not over it yet. But, anyways, this is not what we're here to talk about. 1954. President Nasser, through politics and public pressure, he minimized the British influence in Egypt until all British troops departed Egypt, leaving behind one of their largest military bases in the world. They were not happy, but they did not have a choice. Nasser was hated by the British government. However, he became a hero in many other countries around the world that were still under the French and the British occupation. Resistance movements increased against the British and French colonization after being inspired by Nasser. You can imagine how much Nasser was not liked by the French and the British at this point. Now let's talk about the crisis itself. Between 1954 and 1956, Nasser was trying to get closer to the US and to the West in general. However, it was difficult for the US and the West to have close relationship with Israel and Egypt at the same time due to their conflict. Also, the US had its doubt that Nasser was getting closer to the Soviets. On a separate front, Nasser was becoming the leader of the Arab countries, and Israel was concerned that Nasser could pose a threat to Israel if he succeeds to unify the Arabs against it. In 1956, Nasser wanted to build a dam. So you see it here on the map in the south. Nasser wanted to build a dam on the River Nile to save fresh water from going to waste in the Med, and to save Egypt from floods, and also to generate electricity. It was a massive project at the time and very important for Egypt's development. Nasser asked the US and the West to finance the project. However, they put some harsh political conditions on him that Nasser found abusive and rejected the conditions. After being rejected by the US and the West to finance the dam, Nasser reassessed Egypt's resources and found that nationalizing the canal that was still under the French and English control would allow him to finance the construction of the dam. And Nasser's argument was the canal was built by Egyptian slave and during the occupation time, and Egyptians were not benefiting from their canal. So he nationalized the canal, and he also started approaching the USSR that was already in Cold War with the US. So he exploited the Cold War to his benefit, and he approached with he came closer to the Soviets. The nationalization of the canal greatly provoked the British and French government. They already hated Nasser. However, now they decided to remove him. The British government started illustrating Nasser as a dictator and fascist that must be removed to support the global trade stability and to protect the Egyptian citizens from him. Israel, who did not like Nasser either, exploited this opportunity and agreed with the French that Israel would advance towards the canal from the east. So you can see here on the map. And this will give a reason for the French and the British to invade Egypt to stabilize the region and secure the canal. So the plan is Israel attacks this way, French and English, or British correction, come to the rescue and invade Egypt, secure the canal, and eventually remove Nasser. As agreed, the Israeli forces started to advance towards the canal from the east. The British troops started to invade Egypt from the city of Port Said in the north, so right in this point. And by the way, this is my hometown where I grew up, and I'm very proud of it. Anyways, national resistance in Port Said against the British troops was very strong, and it was much harder for the British military than expected. So many British soldiers lost their lives in Port Said, which made the British citizens in the UK realize that Nasser is not what their media said about him, about being fascist or being a dictator or hated by his people. So the British public put lots of pressure on their government to withdraw from Egypt. So they were against this war. And if I go next slide, here you go. The Soviets were worried about their image of not being able to support its allies. So they asked the British and the French to depart Egypt immediately, and they also hinted to use nuclear weapons against London and Paris if they do not comply. The US was unhappy with Britain and France for not discussing this war with the US prior to executing, and the US put pressure in the UN on Britain and France to depart Egypt immediately. So in summary, the Suez Crisis could have led the world to a World War III. It was clear to me that the British and French did not realize the new shift of power after World War II, and they were no longer superpowers as they thought they were. This was somehow a brief explanation of the Suez Crisis. I hope it will help you during your reading for Lesson 8. And that's all I have. Thank you very much and miss you all.